Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we can see it.
All right. So good evening. There we go. So good evening, everybody. My name is Matt Capel. I'm one of the newest members. I joined sometime last year. And I'll be giving tonight's presentation, which I've called From Parliament to the Public School, a Week in Denmark and Norway. So this is a little bit of a travel log about my most recent trip to Denmark and Norway. But I had some pretty unique experiences on that trip that I think lend a bit of perspective into daily life in those two countries. So hopefully it will be entertaining and educational. But the reason for this trip is my younger sister, Adeline, who's a senior at Cornell University, was studying abroad in Copenhagen. And we figured, hard to miss an opportunity like that. So the whole family went over. If you want to advance to the next slide. So we started our trip in Copenhagen. I actually arrived a little after the rest of my family. I was, constrained by the spring break schedule at the high school I work at. So my family went ahead of me, and I joined them there. We started in Copenhagen, which is the capital of Denmark, and it was a major trading port. In fact, Copenhagen actually translates to merchant harbor. And you can see here on this decorative map just how infused with waterways the city is, which will become important in a moment. So on the eastern side, you can see there are several shipping channels and canals bisecting the city. And then over here on the western side, there's a series of man-made lakes kind of bordering the central city and allowing for a lot of water access. And you can also see some of the shapes down here and up there. Copenhagen was a fortified city. It was fortified in the mid-17th century by King Christian IV. Of course, as warfare has developed, many of those fortifications have become obsolete, and most of them have actually been turned into parks. That star up at the top is the old citadel, defending the main entry into the city. That's the Little Mermaid statue right next to it, and that is now, there's still a military base there, but it's much more of an urban park kind of feel. There are some pictures on the next slide. And then this section down here is actually, I won't talk about it too much, but if you're interested, I'm happy to chat after. It's been taken over by an anarchist commune. So it's Freetown Christiana, which is a really interesting place. My family and I went and walked around. It's strange. But happy to chat more if you're interested. So next slide. So I arrived 2 days after my family, just in time for Easter Sunday. So the 6 of us went to Mass here at St. Albans, which is an Anglican church on the north side of the city. And then after that, we went out for a nice pastry breakfast and a walk through some of those fortifications turned parks. So that up in the top corner is actually part of that citadel that's been converted into a park. And then that's the 6 of us down in the bottom corner. It's me, obviously, my younger sister, Caroline next to me, my mother, my sister Addie, who was studying abroad in the foreground, my father behind, and then my sister Natalie on the far right. So we're a merry band. So you can advance to the next slide. So after our morning, we walked back through the city, and then I thought this was a really neat way to get around. In Copenhagen, they have a service called the Go Boat, where you can rent one of these small boats with an outboard motor, and they actually give you free rein of the canals. There's a map of where you're allowed to go, where you're not allowed to go, but you don't take a pilot. It's just you and whoever you bring along, and you can bring some provisions. We brought some snacks and drinks, and just toured the canals. It was a unique and eye-opening way to see the city. You can see up here in the corner, my sister at the helm, there's quite a few apartment buildings along the water. It really gave off a kind of Nordic Venice kind of feel. So that was a lot of fun. No boating license required. So we can go on to the next slide. So after that first day, there we go. After that first day, my family went off to Norway to go visit some family. up there, which we'll get into in a moment. I stayed behind with my younger sister, and we enjoyed the great Danish food scene. So for starters, I might butcher this pronunciation, but the Lagerhuset over here on the right is my sister's favorite chain of Danish bakeries. So I really enjoyed that greatly. This is one of my favorite pastries. It's the chocolate version, but it translates to cinnamon snail. And so it's the Danish version of a cinnamon bun. This is like a chocolate bun. And so I had perhaps too many of them, but you know, you're only in Denmark every now and again, so I thought it best to enjoy. And then my sister took me to this food hall at the top, which was a combination covered market and food hall. So there were a number of grocery stalls with meat, fish, cheese, produce, as well as some restaurants and specialty food vendors. So while I was there, I sampled this, which is a picture from their menu. But smørrebrød is one of the iconic Danish dishes. If you're not familiar, it's a slice of coarse-grained rye bread, or rugbrød, which I know we've had at some Sons of Norway events, covered with an assortment of toppings as a kind of open-faced sandwich. So I had the roast beef one with some gherkins and onions, and oh, it was marvelous. And then after that, I checked into my hotel. If you want to advance the slide. So this was a little bit of an adventure. I figured I'm young, you know, got to stick to a budget. I'm feeling adventurous. So I decided to check out this hotel chain called City Hub, which is a minimalist hotel brand with locations across the Netherlands and the Nordic countries. And the basic idea, and these are some pictures I pulled from their website, is instead of a room, you get this little pod. So for mine, you know, neither this is a picture of me and mine, but I had the bottom pod. So it was about maybe a king-size bed and a little walk-in closet, which was all I needed. I intended to spend as much time out in the city as I could. I really just needed a place to sleep. It was pretty comfortable. It's sound-insulated pods, so you're not bothered by everyone else. There are communal restrooms and showers and a communal gathering space with refrigerators, kitchen appliances, and a seating area with games. I might not recommend if you're going to be there for 2 weeks or to live permanently, but for a budget-friendly travel option for a 20-something, it was great. I think all in all, it was about 330 Danish kroner a night, which at the time was about $50. So it was a pretty good deal for my purposes. And perhaps I'll try a hostel next time. All right, and if you want to advance to the next slide. So of course, my sister, studying abroad, had to go to class. So while she went to class, I went here, which was my favorite building in all of Denmark. And this is Christiansborg Slot, or Christiansborg Palace. And this is a royal palace and government building. It's actually the seat of the Danish government. And all three kind of elements of government are in this building. It has the royal throne room and reception hall for the monarch. It has the parliament chamber for the legislature and the executive in the form of the prime minister. And there's an outbuilding that also has the Danish Supreme Court. Now this is the third building. This is the third iteration of the palace. The previous two burned down in fires. And this is actually the fifth building on the site. There were a number of earlier medieval castles. And so this site, this little island in the center of Copenhagen, has been a spot of Danish government since around the 1100s. So it was really neat to go and explore that. I don't know if you'll advance to the next slide. I think the most unique experience I had is that I actually had the privilege to sit in on a live session of the Danish Parliament, the Folketing. So a couple quick notes about the Danish government. For those of you who aren't familiar, much of this is applicable to both Norway and Sweden. Denmark is still a constitutional monarchy. So they have a king, but the king does not have any formal powers. He's more of a symbolic figurehead, the head of state. The current king is Frederick X. He's the son of the recently abdicated queen, who you may be more familiar with. He actually assumed the throne while my sister was there. And she got to see the proclamation. In Denmark, they don't do coronations, but they do a proclamation from the balcony of the palace. And so she was one of the tens of thousands thronging the streets. A once-in-a-lifetime experience. But beneath the king, Denmark is a parliamentary representative democracy. So they have a parliament called the Folketing, which is a unicameral legislature, a one house, unlike the United States, where we have the Senate and the House of Representatives. In Denmark, they just have the one house parliament, and their executive branch is actually from that parliament. The prime minister or the statsminister is the head of the government, and they are the leader of the majority party or coalition within parliament. Denmark does have two larger parties, but unlike the United States, it has a number of smaller, significant parties in addition to that. So if no one party has enough seats to hold a majority, they form like little alliances of coalitions, of groups of parties, and the leader becomes the prime minister. And they also have a Supreme Court that's relatively similar to the United States. So Denmark's government is very highly regarded, both at home and abroad. It has high levels of transparency and accountability, and it's considered one of the least corrupt countries in the world. It's sort of one of the models for how democracies should function. It has a full democracy rating from several international organizations. So I was excited as a government major and political scholar to get to see it in action. The day that I went, it was not nearly this well attended. This is a photo from the state opening of Parliament, where everyone shows up. When I was there, I want to say there were at most maybe 20 or 30 members of Parliament. It was a much smaller debate. I was in the galleries all the way back at the top, and I struggled to follow along because, of course, it was in Danish. But I did manage to get my hands on a copy of the agenda, which I've brought here tonight. There's a screenshot of it over on the corner. And with the help of some Google Translate, I figured out it was a debate on environmental legislation. And I pulled the actual article. It was the reading of a new bill to amend the Environmental Protection Act, which basically governs regulations protecting water wells. So new construction around water wells and drilling and so forth. So a little bit stale, but it was really exciting to actually see that in action. I don't know whether they voted to approve or deny. I couldn't say, but it was fun to sit there and observe the proceedings. And then after that, next slide, please. I toured the palace. So like I said, there's the Parliament chamber, but there is also the royal apartments as well. It's no longer a residence, but it is the official seat of the monarchy. So up in the corner, there's a selfie of me and the official Danish throne. In an anteroom is this rug with the woven coat of arms for Denmark, representing the different parts of the realm. And then that over on the right-hand side is the Royal Banquet Hall, which has a number of really ornate tapestries depicting basically all of Danish history, and there's a number of events there. And then this photo in the bottom is not mine, but it's just to give you a sense of what the building looks like. And so after my tour, I went over, there's an adjoining bridge that takes you to the National Library, which has both the more modern public library section, which they affectionately call the Black Diamond. It's an exciting example of some more modern architecture, but it also is joined to the older King's Library, which is that older, this kind of style of architecture. So that was really slick. And then after that, I met up with my sister, and we went to the top of the tower for some pretty spectacular views of Copenhagen. There's actually a restaurant in the tower as well. We chose not to go there. It was pretty booked by the time we arrived, but the views were pretty incredible. It's a beautiful city, and once you get a sense of the different neighborhoods, it's fun to look out and see all the canals and that sort of thing. So that was the end of my stay in Denmark, and I turned my attention northward. Next slide, please. And perhaps foolishly, I decided instead of taking the hour-and-a-half flight from Copenhagen to Oslo, I've always been a great train enthusiast. And I've really enjoyed my time on various European railroads, especially when I studied abroad in Spain. I really enjoyed traveling on the Spanish rail system. And so I decided to take a more green travel approach, and I took a train from Copenhagen to Oslo. So I took my first train here, my tickets over here. I took my first train from Copenhagen to Gothenburg, which is one of those two dots midway up Sweden. And so that was about a 4-hour train ride. And the highlight was crossing the Øresund Bridge, which is a 5-mile bridge over open water over the sound that divides Denmark and Norway. Denmark and Sweden, my apologies. So that was pretty spectacular, just being on this suspension bridge, maybe 2.5 miles out over open water, and you could see a wind farm on one side, some passing shipping vessels on the other side. That was really quite something. And then we went up the coastline and we arrived in Gothenburg, and then we had about a 50-minute stop to switch trains. So I threw my luggage in a storage locker and went out on the town for about half an hour. Walked around, didn't see much, but it was a cute little city. I'd love to go back someday. And then I got back just in time to collect my things, change trains, and then I took a 3.5-hour train from Gothenburg to Oslo. And that was absolutely stunning. We went up through the Swedish lake country, so just these stunning vistas of lakes and forests. We passed through a region that had just received some new snow, so it was just some stunning vistas of the countryside before I finally crossed into Norway and arrived in Oslo to meet up with my cousin. And on the next slide, we have some photos from my trip. So that's one of the lakes up top. We stopped at a tiny little rail station to let a freight train pass. And I got out of the train and took that photo. This is Gothenburg down here. This is one of the rivers or canals that goes through. This is Copenhagen Central Station, which I walked into, and it's this really long train hall, and they had the Danish flag like every 10 feet, the Dannebrog. And that was just really, really cool to see. And then that's a photo of me with the train over on the right. And in true Boy Scout fashion, I had my suitcase backpack on my back and my smaller day pack on my front, so I was heavily laden, but I had a really fun time. It ended up being an 8-hour trip, which is a little bit longer than an hour and a half, but I really enjoyed it greatly. I was glad that I had done that. And then if you'll go to the next slide. So now, as we turn our attention to Norway, just a bit of geography to give you all a sense of where all I went. I'm sure as most of you know, this is a map of the Oslo Fjord in the Oslo capital region. There's Oslo, that dot in the middle. There's the airport up at the top with that little airport icon. I had fun putting all the little icons on this map. And immediately east of Oslo is the town of Sandvika. I guess you should say smaller city. And that's where my cousin Katrina and her family live. They technically live in Blommenholm, which is just outside of Sandvika. But that wasn't large enough to show up on the map. So I put a little icon there. That's about a 15 to 20 minute train ride or drive from downtown Oslo. And that's in the Bærum commune in Akershus county, just outside of Oslo. And then a little further south, we have the Star on Tonsberg, which is where my family is originally from, going back several generations. And then a little house icon next to Sandefjord, which is a smaller coastal town, and that's where my Uncle Roy and Tante Ellen live now. And I've been to see them a few times. They've come to visit me in the States. And then that tiny little cabin icon, it didn't show up terribly well. Down at the bottom is their hytte, just a little further south, maybe a 20-minute drive. And we have a lot of fun memories there. It's their summer cabin. So Sandefjord is about an hour-and-a-half drive or train south of Oslo. It's the Sandefjord commune in the Vestfold. And then if we go to the next slide, this rivals Parliament, I think, for my favorite part of the trip, which was I actually had the chance to visit an active Norwegian school. So my cousin Katrina has 2 children, Emily and Matthias. Matthias was in 6th grade at the time that I went to visit, which was last April. And so Katrina reached out to his teacher and got me an invitation to go visit his class. So I went and spent the morning with a 6th grade Norwegian class, which was really fun for me. At the time I was doing my student teaching in a 6th grade classroom just up the road in New Kent. So I really enjoyed getting the view of both the American system and the Norwegian system. A quick overview of some things I found interesting about the Norwegian education system for you all. There are 3 levels of lower education. You start with primary school, which is grades 1 through 7. It's more comparable to our American elementary school. Then you go into lower secondary school, or a more advanced iteration of our middle schools, which are grades 8 through 10. And those 2 levels, primary and lower secondary, are compulsory. The third is not, and that's upper secondary school, which is more preparation for higher education or vocational studies. And even though it's not compulsory, many Norwegians do go, and that's 3 years. So similar to ours, although some minor differences. But another thing that drew me to the Norwegian education system is their language instruction, or at least what Katrina told me of it. So when students enter primary school, they receive instruction in their regional dialect of Norwegian. I'm sure as most of you know, there are the 2 dialects of Norwegian, Bokmål and Norsk. So whichever dialect is more prominent in your region, you receive instruction in that language, as well as English, which they start right away, which contributes to why so many Norwegians are fluent English speakers. Then when you enter secondary school, you continue learning your dialect of Norwegian and English, but you also pick up the 2nd dialect of Norwegian. And then at a later point, I'm not sure exactly when it begins, you begin learning a foreign language, which in most Norwegian schools is Spanish, French, or German. So by the time you graduate, you've received instruction in 4 languages, 3 distinct languages, and then another dialect of Norwegian, which, compare that to our American system, where many students are lucky if they leave high school speaking 2 languages. Because we start our language instruction so much later. And as a note off of that is many Norwegians are bilingual, speak fluent Norwegian and English, and many speak an additional language as well, which is just really remarkable and a very valuable skill. Some other differences I noticed. One that's especially interesting to me in my current job as an English as a second language teacher is their different approach to immigrant education. So here in the United States, if you arrive in the US as a non-English speaking immigrant student, you're placed directly into the general population or the general curriculum. You do receive active support from an ESL teacher like myself, but the idea is that the exposure to the your English-speaking peers in the English-speaking classes will stimulate your English language development. In contrast, in Norway, your first year you are placed in a separate school where you get a crash course in both the Norwegian language as well as elements of Norwegian society and culture. Basically, a tutorial on all the survival skills you'll need to really acclimate and succeed in the Norwegian education system. So there, yes?
When you go to the 3rd level of schooling, what is the ratio between what I call academic versus vocational?
That I don't know off the top of my head. I know they used to be separate tracks, but my reading suggests that in recent years they modified it so it's more of one track with 2 focuses, because they had some problems with students that would, for example, go into the more higher education focus and then want to switch, and they'd have to start all over again, or vice versa. So I don't know how many do vocational versus education, versus higher ed, but it's a pretty good mix. But so there's 2 different approaches to immigrant education. There's merits to both and cons to both. In the American system, it's a little less active support. It's a little more into the deep end. But at the same time, you're making friends with your English-speaking peers right away. You're getting acclimated a little faster. Whereas the Norwegian system is a little more guided, a little more structured, but you are in a separate space for that first year and not immediately immersed in the population. Another difference I noticed is that, unlike American schools, Norwegian schools do not provide lunch. Every student brings their lunch from home. And you are not allowed to send your student with sweets or soda, only healthy foods. And if you don't follow those guidelines, you'll actually receive communication from the school administration reminding you of nutritional guidelines and healthy eating for your students, which you know, based on what I know of the parent-teacher relationship in the United States, that's pretty different from how things are done here in the United States. But with enough of the overview, on the next slides, we have a photo of Matthias's classroom that I took, as well as a poster. They were working on a project of making informational posters about the different Nordic countries. So I went to Matthias's school. It's a walking distance from his house. And then I met his teacher, Jorn. And he showed me around the building. And I caught the curiosity of a couple of the younger kids who said, "Oh, look, Harry Potter has come to visit." So even in Norway, that continues to follow me. It was a flattering compliment. And then we had a Q&A session with Matthias's class. And they were all excited that, quote, the American had come to visit. And Matthias was especially excited. I was amused because the night I arrived, he was very shy and didn't really want to talk to me. But as soon as I arrived in his class, he was puffing out his chest and said, "The American's living with me." So I said, okay, now that I'm a desirable commodity, I see how it goes. But our Q&A session covered a whole variety of topics, all in English, which is remarkable when you think about it, that a bunch of sixth graders are fluent English speakers in Norway. I was really quite jealous. We talked about the school schedule. They were surprised that I start my school day at 7:30, although I don't think they were jealous. We also talked about some pets. I believe pet ownership is a little less common in Norway, although I'm not entirely sure. But they were very excited to hear about my family's dogs and cats and even hermit crabs. That was a big draw. On a more somber note, they did have lots of questions about school safety. We talked extensively about our intruder drills, metal detectors, other safety concerns in the United States, which were entirely foreign and kind of exciting for them, because as far as I can tell, school violence does not exist in Norway in anything like what it does in the States. So I did have to remind them a few times that this was a very serious topic and not a, oh wow, things are wild across the ocean. But it was really eye-opening to hear some of their questions on that. But then at the end, on a much lighter note, one of the students was excited to ask if I was a Swiftie or a fan of Taylor Swift. And having 3 younger sisters and being a fan of music, I told them of course. And I was amused to see not only the differences between Norway and the United States, but also a small taste of globalization and just how much American culture has spread across the world. So after our Q&A session, we played card games in the hallway to practice our English in social settings. Matthias and his friends taught me how to play a game called The Idiot, and I lost, so they said it made me the idiot, which was a flattering compliment from my 12-year-old cousin. And then 2 students had asked Jorn if they could bake a chocolate cake, because the exception to the no sweets rule is for special occasions. And so they said, "Please, Mr. Jorn, the American is coming. May we make a cake?" And he said yes. And so we all had slices, only one slice of cake per student. But we all had slices of cake and celebrated, and then they went to recess, and I stayed to chat with Jorn. So that was just a really neat experience. I was thankful for the opportunity. And then I walked home. It was about a 5-minute walk in the snow, which was great. And then Katrina was working that day, so she dropped me off at some of the museums closer to Oslo. On the next slide, you can see, I'm sure many of you have visited if you've been to Norway, but the Norwegian Folk Museum is a large open-air museum with a collection of authentic historic buildings from across Norway. And this, of course, is the iconic Stave Church. This church was constructed in around 1200, and then it was brought to the museum in 1884 and paid for by King Oscar II. And so right as I arrived, it began to snow, and it was magical. All these old, historic, wooden Norwegian buildings and the snow, and I went inside the church, and here's a photo from one of the galleries. It was just stunning. It was so quiet and peaceful, and a chance to appreciate some of the artwork and the craftsmanship. And then, on my way out of the museum, I discovered a few interesting things that connect to my time in Denmark. On the next slide, this is an exhibit in the attached museum called The Protectors of the Constitution. And this is actually a recreation of the first Norwegian Parliament chamber, the Storting, which was used from 1814 to 1854. And I know we've talked about this a little bit in previous lectures on the 17th of May, but in 1814, Norway had a brief-lived independence attempt. After the Napoleonic Wars, the Kingdom of Denmark, which at the time controlled Norway, was forced to cede Norway to Sweden. The Norwegians were upset, understandably, about being handed off without their consent. So they made a bid for independence. They assembled a small convention, drafted and adopted a constitution, and declared their independence, and were swiftly defeated by Sweden. However, I believe the war lasted 2 weeks. However, the independence movement and its ideals lived on. Sweden and Norway were joined as a personal union, so two separate kingdoms governed by the same king, instead of Norway becoming a province of Sweden and being fully absorbed. And Norway was allowed to keep its constitution, albeit with a few modifications. But then after the constitution was signed in the countryside, the parliament gathered in the city in Oslo, and they used a spare room in the Christiana Cathedral School as a meeting place, and this is a recreation of that chamber at the Folk Museum. So I thought it was neat to see, the beginnings of parliamentary government, as well as in Denmark, some parliamentary government in all its modern glory. And then on the next slide, this is a smaller outbuilding. This is one of the historic buildings. It's a recreation of a rural Norwegian school. In the 1860s, they passed the school law, which led to the construction of new schoolhouses all across rural Norway. And so this is a pretty accurate reconstruction of what it would have looked like. You could see on the left-hand wall, there's a poster with some different measurements. I think that's a barrel and the different sizes of barrels. And then it's hard to see, but that over the podium is a map of Scandinavia and Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. So again, fun to see the modern version and then the earlier version. Although I think that might not be as fun to teach in as some of the classrooms today. All right. And then after my time at the Folk Museum, I took a quick train into Oslo proper. I went to the Royal Palace, which is the current residence of the royal family, which was a lot of fun. I walked around. I went to some of the stores. I got some fun pastries. I had a great time. I bought a Norwegian flag, which I have up here at the front. I have an assortment of things from my travels. And then the next day, on the next slide, we have my cousin Katrina took me on a tour of some of the hills surrounding Oslo. And we started at Holmenkollen, which is home to the ski jump used in the 1952 Oslo Winter Olympics. This is a selfie of me on top of Holmenkollen, actually, looking down at the Oslo fjord. And the ski jump has an attached museum on the history of skiing, which was fun to walk through and see all the exhibits. Especially, I took a photo over here. I think it may interest you. I found that is the original flag from some of Nansen's Arctic expeditions. And you'll notice, if you take a look in the upper left canton, that small square, that fun design of the combination of the Norwegian and the Swedish flags. And that's because this is the flag of combined Sweden-Norway, or Norway-Sweden. And the creative way that they came up with joining the two kingdoms without fully making them one country was to have the Norwegian flag with a small combined design in the upper corner, if you were in Norway. And in Sweden, they have the Swedish flag with a small design in the upper corner. So a nice way to honor their respective heritages, but also the combination of states. But of course, after that union was dissolved, they went back to using their respective flags. So a fun piece of history. And speaking of history, after Holmenkollen, Katrina took me to another site on the next slide, which is the Rose Garden, which is an open-air art installation on the hills north of Oslo. And it's a collection of concrete walls with murals. And this is both an art installation but also a memorial on more of a somber note to honor the victims of the Holocaust and the Nazi occupation of Norway. So working through some of that trauma through art. So this particular mural I was really drawn to, both artistically and for its significance. This mural depicts the burning of Hammerfest, which was an incident in which the Nazis forcibly evacuated and then destroyed a Norwegian town. I'm not entirely clear as to why. My personal speculations are some resistance activity. But there's an apocryphal story that while the Nazis were doing this to the town, in the destruction there was a piano left on the dockside. And one of the Nazi officers sat down and played Mozart on the piano while the town burned. So really a more somber and reflective moment, but an important reminder, that history is, not too far behind us, and some of the incidents that happened in other parts of the world that we really should remember and honor those that were victims of those. So while this is a bit more on the sad side, on the second slide, on the next slide, we have another mural that celebrates the resilience of the Norwegian people. So this is on the carriage or podium. This is King Haakon VII in exile in London, carrying out the annual 17th of May celebrations. That even though Norway was under occupation and the Norwegian people were facing these impossible challenges, their spirit lived on, and they still managed to gather and celebrate their heritage and their country and hope for a brighter tomorrow. So I appreciated the juxtaposition of those two. And there were many, many more murals, and I took lots of pictures, but there's not enough time to share all of them. And then after that, changing gears entirely, on the next slide, this is another note about Norwegian trains, because after my time with Katrina and after her tour of the region around Oslo, I went down to visit my uncle and my aunt in Sandefjord. And I took yet another train, which I had a marvelous time. So this is one of the Vi trains, short for Veigroepen, which is the Norwegian state-owned railway company. And they run trains across all of Norway, but they have an especially extensive commuter rail system in the greater Oslo region. And this is a map of it right here, Oslo in the center and all the different spokes. And this may look like a small map or like your typical subway system, but this network actually runs all the way to cities 2 hours from Oslo. So it really acts as a feeder network to bring people from the more outlying regions of the capital all the way into the center. These trains are pretty timely, reliable, and an affordable way to get around. For example, a train from Oslo to Sandefjord, they run about every half hour or maybe a little longer depending on the day. It's about an hour and a half, and it's $35 the last I checked. And you get some stunning views of the Norwegian countryside that you can enjoy, not having to focus on road safety behind the wheel. And being without a car, this was a pretty great way for me to get around. My relatives had a lot of fun dropping me off at train stations, picking me up from train stations. I actually, after Katrina dropped me off at the Folk Museum, I walked from the Folk Museum to the train station, took the train into Oslo, and then when I was done, took the train back home and walked home from the station. So it's a different way of life. But another thing I'll draw your attention to, this orange line, which you can't see terribly well, but that is the Airport Express train, which runs, unlike the rest of the trains, which make more regional stops. The Airport Express train has a couple major stops at some of the major stations, but it's an express train straight to the Oslo airport. So the idea being, instead of renting a car or taking the regular train system, you just show up at Oslo Central Station, show them your ticket, hop on the train, and it'll take you straight up to the airport very quickly. And the train station is actually in the basement of the airport. So you get off your train, there's an escalator, and then you're right at security and bag check, and you can go right on into the airport. The public transportation system is much more developed in Norway than in most of the United States, and I made great use of it. It was a lot of fun, and I'm sure I cut quite a sight with my 2 backpacks and my American accent, but I had a lot of fun. So while I was, there's a train right there, that's exciting. So while I was in Sandefjord, on the next slide, I had the chance to go down and visit Roy and Ellen's hytte, which is their summer cottage, about a 20-minute drive south of Sandefjord. I have many fond memories of this place. We've had a number of family reunions and events over the years. I haven't been to most of them because it is all the way in Norway, but I do enjoy the pictures. So Roy was concerned about the plumbing. There had been a recent couple of cold days and good property maintenance. We went to check it out. And I was thrilled to see it in the snow. I've only ever seen it in the summertime. So it was picturesque to see some of the Norwegian landscapes with these giant rocks and the cute little cottages. It was really nice to see that. So that was a fun moment. And then that was the end of my trip, and I went back to Sandefjord. They put me on the train. I took the Airport Express off to the Oslo airport and flew home by way of Iceland. But on the next slide, just a quick note, part of the reason I enjoy my trip to this trip and previous trips to Norway so much is the fact that I have so much family over there. So my grandfather, Jan Erik Kamfjord, immigrated from Norway when he was 13 in 1953, and most of his family stayed behind. So while my grandfather has been in the United States ever since, spent most of his life in Ohio, although now he's currently in Pennsylvania. The rest of his family is back in Norway. He has 2 younger brothers, Tore and Roy. I've never met Tore, but I am very close with my Uncle Roy, who's over on the right. He's quite the character, Uncle Roy, and he married Tante Ellen, who had 2 children from a previous marriage, Jan and Katrina. And this is me and Katrina in their home in Sandvika, as well as her 2 children, Emily the elder and Matthias the younger. So I've been to Norway 3 times. The first was when I was 12 myself, and my family went for a week to visit family, and I actually remember Matthias as a 1-year-old baby. So it's wild to see how much he's grown. And then I went a few years ago on my way home from my study abroad experience in Spain. I figured I was already in Europe. It wasn't that much more difficult to extend my return trip a little bit, and I flew up to Norway for 2 days. But it was really great to have more than 48 hours this last time around, and get to see a few more museums and have a lot of quality family time. This picture over here on the right is from when Roy impressed upon me that we must go to his favorite sports bar in downtown Sandefjord. So we had a great time, and he's been to the States a few times to visit. And then on the final slide, just of course celebrating as much as it was a sightseeing adventure and the chance to learn a little more about the ways of life in different countries. It was also a great chance to spend some quality time with my immediate family. And so this is me and my 3 sisters along one of the canals in Copenhagen. And that's me over on the left. I'm the only boy. And then in not age order, because the oldest of my younger sisters is actually the shortest, which she is not keen on at all. Immediately next to me, we have my younger sister, Caroline, who's just starting her freshman year at Boston College. Adeline, the study abroad student, is in the middle, and she is a senior at Cornell, and she's getting excited to attend school to be a PA next year. And then all the way on the right-hand side is my youngest sister, Natalie, who is in her junior year of high school and excited to be in the college search. She's planning to become a dairy cattle veterinarian in the future. So we're a merry band. We have lots of fun adventures, and I appreciate your time to hear about this one. So thanks so much, folks. I appreciate it.
And the snow around it and how nice you thought. Did you say you were there in April?
Yes, I was there the last week of March into April. So that was actually, do I have the date? No, but that was April 3rd or 4th, I believe. And it was unusual. It was not snowing when I initially arrived, and then it started to snow. And they got a few inches, but Norwegian weather is a bit different than it is here in the States. Yes?
What is the school's hours?
Oh, I should have written that down when I was there. I want to say they start closer to 9 o'clock. I think at least for the younger grades, which I know we do here in the States, depending on school district. I was excited because I got to sleep in a little bit. I didn't have to go to school with Matthias. But it is significantly later than 7:30. They were surprised that we went to school that early. Yes, sir.
Have many of your family visited you in the States?
Yes. So Roy and Ellen have been many times. In fact, my grandfather and my grandmother, who is of Danish heritage herself, had a stint where they would host different Norwegian relatives when they were, had children at home themselves. So my mother has many stories of all the different Norwegian uncles and cousins coming for a semester or a school year. Roy is significantly younger than my grandfather. So when he came for his year, I want to say my mother and her sisters were in elementary school and middle school, and Roy was the exciting 18-year-old senior exchange student. And I've heard many tales about his antics. So he, and since in more recent years, he and his wife have been to visit us a couple of times for major life events. They came for Christmas a couple of times, as well as this last September for Labor Day. We assembled the entire family for the first time in a while, and they made the trip over for that. And the rest of the family I've not had over in the States, but I know Katrina is excited to come bring her children to the United States at some point. And we floated the idea of, since they have been such gracious hosts of us, we floated the idea of hosting Emily for some significant time. She wants to study abroad in the United States. And we don't have much to offer her because my parents live in a more rural area of upstate New York. I live here in Williamsburg. None of us live in the more glamorous cities of Manhattan or Los Angeles or Chicago. But Katrina actually was a study abroad student herself. She spent a semester at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So she is excited for her daughter to get that experience. And maybe Matthias in due time, but that's a few years away. Yes?
What do they do with homework? I have visited Finland, and Finland has a history of having very good education. In fact, being number one in the world in the past, anyway. And they don't do homework. They don't have homework even through high school.
I think it's similar. Don't hold me to it. But it wasn't in my notes. After my trip, I wrote down everything while it was fresh in my mind. So I'm not 100% sure, but I would believe that. That's certainly the impression I got from him.
So that means they really maximize the time that they are at school.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they also said that kids do not start school till 6 years old. We were with a family.
Yes,
So,
yeah.
We were doing it firsthand with the children. So I thought that was quite interesting.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely eye-opening to see how other people do it.
And what about Latin? Do none of the schools teach Latin?
Not to my knowledge. I'm sure some do. Maybe in some urban areas, or I don't know to what extent there are religious schools in Norway. I wouldn't be surprised, but I didn't find any in my research, although I didn't spend too much time on that part of the slides. Of course. Anyone else have any other questions? And then if anyone's interested, at the end, I brought a few items from my travels, and I put them here on the front table. I have some, the most current Norwegian money, some brochures. I brought the agenda that they gave me at the Folketing. So if you want to try your hand at Danish, although I do have the English copy. I was excited to buy some flags. I didn't show it because I didn't have any good pictures from it. But I went to the Danish Resistance Museum, which I didn't have much time at, but was a really well put together museum on the history of Danish resistance to the Nazi occupation. And there are many iconic stories, such as the king at the time riding unaccompanied through the streets of Norway, and the Germans were concerned about his safety, and he said all of Denmark is my bodyguard. Similar sentiments to another story about the King of Norway in later years. There was also a story about the Danish king, upon hearing that all of the Jews in Denmark would be forced to wear the Yellow Star of David, agreed with the Nazi plan, and then overnight all of Denmark wore the Yellow Star. So the Nazis threw in the towel and gave up on that one. But after hearing all these remarkable stories of resilience and resistance, I figured it was appropriate to grab a flag myself. Yes, sir?
Did you visit in Oslo at the Akerhus, the Norwegian Resistance Museum?
I didn't have the chance to. It's on my list for the future, but I wanted to, but I didn't get the chance.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. It's a great museum.
Absolutely. Well, and it's fascinating to see, we have our own rich history in the United States, especially here in Colonial Williamsburg. But it's really remarkable to see some of the sites over there, especially since some of their major events didn't happen all that long ago. World War II was, 80 years ago, I believe? So really kind of eye-opening. Katrina has sent me Snapchats, because that's one of her preferred methods of communication. She sends me Snapchats of some different hikes she does, and there was one that was just a Nazi turret in the forest somewhere. It's not even a museum. It's just an abandoned turret from the period. But on a lighter note, I also get Snapchats of Emily at handball games, Matthias on his way to soccer practice. It's a lot of fun. But yeah. Yes?
Is there a separation of church and state when it comes to public schools?
So in public schools, yes. I believe they do take religious courses, but it's more of a history of world religions rather than Christian-focused. There are state churches in both Denmark and Norway, as well as Sweden, I believe. But it's an interesting balance. It's similar to the United Kingdom in the sense that there's an official state church, and the monarch is a religious figure, the leader of those churches. But it's not, a theocracy or anything like that. There is still that strong division between church and state.
I think Sweden is separated now.
Okay, Sweden is no longer.
Yes.
Okay, right. Now, I don't know very much about Sweden. I've only spent 50 minutes in Gothenburg. But I'll do my research.
I've been there several times.
Oh, great. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much, folks. I really appreciate it.